Early winter settled over the high mountain valley in 1891 with little warning. Snow had not yet closed the passes, but the air carried a dry cold that lingered in the lungs and stiffened exposed hands. The settlement consisted of a few scattered cabins pressed against the tree line, built low and practical, each one raised according to habits brought from other places. It was there, beneath one of the smallest cabins, that 18-year-old Thomas Alderidge began digging. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss these survival secrets from the mountains. What would you do if a blizzard trapped you underground like Thomas? Would you prepare or rely on luck? Comment your thoughts below. Thomas worked alone, cutting through frozen soil with a short-handled spade, carrying each load away in a wooden crate. He did not speak much while he worked. Those who passed could see the growing pit beneath his floorboards and the rough timbers stacked nearby, waiting to be set in place. The idea spread quickly through the settlement. An underground shelter, carved directly below a cabin, was considered unnecessary at best and foolish at worst. Most families were preparing in the usual ways. Roofs were checked, firewood was stacked high, and gaps in walls were stuffed with rags and moss. Thomas did those things as well, but his real effort remained hidden below the cabin floor. He lowered beams into the pit, braced the sides with stone and packed earth, and measured the space carefully before covering it again with planks. Each evening, smoke rose from his chimney as normal, giving little sign of what lay beneath. Neighbors paused when they passed his cabin. Some shook their heads. Others laughed quietly and moved on. A few offered brief remarks about wasted time or the risk of collapse. Thomas listened without answering. His attention stayed on the work and on the sky above the valley, which had begun to hold its clouds longer than usual. The mountains around the settlement showed small changes that winter. Winds shifted direction more often. Snow dusted the upper slopes and did not melt away. Game moved lower earlier than expected. These signs were noticed, but not discussed at length. Harsh winters were familiar, and most believed their cabins would be enough. As Thomas continued digging, the sense of doubt around him hardened. An experienced foreman, responsible for much of the settlement's early construction, dismissed the shelter openly. He told others that the ground itself would draw the cold inward, that no man needed to live like a burrowing animal. The remark spread, and the underground space beneath Thomas's cabin became a quiet subject of mockery. Thomas finished the main chamber before the first heavy snowfall. He reinforced the ceiling with thick beams and sealed the edges where the earth met the wood. The entrance remained hidden beneath a removable section of floor. From the outside, nothing about the cabin appeared unusual. By the time snow finally covered the valley floor, Thomas was already using the shelter for storage and brief refuge from the cold while working. Few noticed, and fewer still believed it would matter. The winter had not yet shown its strength, but the mountains were already preparing to test every assumption made above ground. The work left his hands cracked and swollen, his breath steady but shallow in the thin air. Each movement followed routine rather than urgency. He neither hurried nor delayed, as though the task answered a need that required no explanation. The valley waited in silence, holding its judgment until weather, not voices, would decide the worth of his labor alone then. The foreman's remarks did not remain private for long. In a settlement where labor was shared and mistakes carried consequences, his opinion traveled quickly. He had overseen the raising of most cabins in the valley and was regarded as a man who understood wood, ground, and weather. When asked about the digging beneath Thomas Alderidge's cabin, he dismissed it as wasted effort and said the ground itself would draw cold rather than keep it out. His words shaped the conversation that followed. Two neighboring homesteaders repeated the judgment while splitting firewood and mending tools. One remarked that no one survived a mountain winter by hiding below it. The other said a solid roof and a strong stove were all that had ever been needed. Their confidence rested on years that had tested them but not broken them. An older town figure, who rarely spoke unless asked, offered quiet agreement. He had seen winters take livestock and supplies, but he trusted methods that had endured so far. He did not mock Thomas directly. He simply noted that digging down invited dampness and collapse, then turned back to his work. Thomas did not respond to any of it. When spoken to directly, he nodded once and continued carrying timber or earth. He offered no explanation of measurements, airflow, or reinforcement. His refusal to justify the shelter was taken by some as stubbornness and by others as inexperience. At 18, he was younger than most who had built alone, and his silence reinforced the belief that he did not yet understand risk. Daily routines continued around the debate. Cabins were checked, fences repaired, and hunting lines reset before deep snow arrived. Thomas participated in shared work without comment, hauling loads and taking his turn when asked. Nothing in his manner suggested disagreement. Only the steady progress beneath his floorboards marked any difference. The foreman eventually addressed him directly near the supply shed. He said, plainly, that time spent underground would be better used reinforcing walls and gathering fuel. Thomas replied only that his firewood was already stacked. The exchange ended there, without raised voices or further discussion. As days passed, the shelter became a point of reference when neighbors spoke of preparation. It was mentioned as an example of misplaced effort, usually without malice. Laughter, when it came, was brief and practical, the kind that assumed experience would settle the matter. Some noticed smaller details during those weeks. Thomas checked the ground around his cabin after each freeze, watching for shifts. He brushed snow from the roof even when accumulation was light. These actions went largely unremarked, folded into the larger belief that he was working harder than necessary. Thomas continued his work at the same pace. He adjusted beams, packed soil tighter against stone, and replaced floor planks carefully so that no gaps remained. His actions offered no argument, only continuation. The settlement accepted the difference without resolution. Tradition held its place, reinforced by familiarity and shared memory. Thomas Alderidge remained quiet within it, neither persuading nor retreating, while winter closed the distance between opinion and consequence. Snow deepened along the tree line, and daylight shortened, leaving less time for correction and more weight on every judgment already spoken by those who waited outside. If you're amazed by how Thomas survived the storm, hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe for more real frontier survival tales. Cold tightened its hold on the valley as November advanced. Frost stayed on shaded ground through midday, and water left in open buckets skinned over before morning chores were finished. Thomas Alderidge adjusted his work to these conditions, beginning before dawn and stopping only when light failed. Each day he carried heavier timber into the pit beneath his cabin, fitting braces against the walls where the soil showed strain. Inside the underground space, the air was still and smelled of earth and fresh-cut wood. Thomas lined the lower walls with flat stone taken from the creek bed, setting each piece by hand and packing soil behind it until the surface no longer shifted. Above, the floorboards were lifted and replaced repeatedly as he tested clearances and weight. Nothing about the process was quick. Mistakes were corrected immediately, not hidden. An elderly resident from a nearby cabin paused often to watch. He leaned on a stick and said little, studying the angles of the beams and the thickness of the supports. Once, he remarked that the ground remembered pressure. Thomas nodded and added another brace. The exchange ended there. No advice followed, and none was asked for. A young child accompanied the older man on some afternoons, standing at the edge of the opening and looking down into the dim space. The child asked whether the hole would flood. Thomas answered that the slope would carry water away. The child remained silent after that, returning later with a scrap of bread to eat while watching. Snow arrived earlier than it had in recent years. It fell lightly at first, then returned in heavier bands that did not fully melt between storms. Paths hardened underfoot, and hauling loads became slower. Thomas shortened his trips to the creek and took stone only from places he could reach safely. He watched the sky as closely as his footing. Within the shelter, he finished sealing the joints between stone and timber, pressing packed soil until his hands ached. He tested the ceiling by standing beneath it with weight added above, listening for movement. When he heard none, he moved on to the entrance, shaping it so it could be closed from inside without force. Neighbors passing the cabin slowed more often now. The work no longer looked careless. It looked heavy. Some stayed only long enough to confirm that he was still digging. Others watched in silence before continuing on their way. No one repeated the earlier laughter. By the time steady snow covered the valley floor, Thomas had reduced the visible signs of his work. The pit was hidden again beneath the floorboards. Only the worn path between the cabin and the woodpile suggested anything out of the ordinary. The margin for correction narrowed with each passing day, and Thomas worked within it without comment, while the mountains pressed closer under their growing weight. He rose before daylight and ended his work after dark, conserving lamps and saving strength. Meals were simple and taken standing, hands still marked with soil. The shelter took its final shape slowly, not as a refuge of comfort but of endurance. When wind began to carry snow sideways across the clearing, Thomas stopped altering the structure. He inspected it once more, replaced the last plank, and waited. The ground above stiffened, the cold deepened, and the work drew no more comment, only attention. It settled into the routine of the valley, as winter continued its quiet advance without pause or mercy. No explanation was offered, and none was expected as days shortened and weather claimed the final authority again. Weather no longer followed a steady pattern as winter tightened. Calm mornings gave way to sudden gusts that swept down from the ridges without warning. Smoke from chimneys bent low, then reversed direction within the same hour. Snow fell, lifted, and fell again, driven sideways across the clearing before settling. The mountain no longer held to one mood, and the change did not go unnoticed. Animals reacted first. Horses shifted their weight and refused to stand with their heads uphill. Dogs paced instead of resting, whining softly at night. Chickens crowded together even during daylight. Hunters returning from the tree line reported game moving erratically, leaving tracks that doubled back on themselves before vanishing into drifts. These signs were spoken of briefly, then dismissed as the normal restlessness of early winter. The distant peaks disappeared behind a low ceiling of cloud that did not lift for days. Sound carried strangely beneath it. An axe strike echoed farther than expected, while voices fell flat after only a few paces. The air felt heavier, though no snow was falling at times. Each morning brought a different wind, cutting through clothing from a new direction and settling into bone. Most of the settlement responded as it always had. Roofs were cleared, doors were checked, and extra firewood was dragged closer to cabin walls. Windows were shuttered against drafts, and livestock were moved into rough shelters near the trees. Preparation followed habit, shaped by winters that had threatened but allowed survival above ground. Thomas Alderidge worked below his cabin during these shifts. He listened to the wind through the earth and adjusted the narrow vents that allowed air into the shelter. He opened and closed them in measured intervals, noting how quickly smoke from a small lamp thinned or thickened. When airflow slowed, he widened one passage and sealed another, using packed soil and stone to guide movement rather than block it entirely. He tested the entrance repeatedly, closing it for longer periods and remaining inside to judge the air. Each trial left him lightheaded only briefly, never long enough to cause alarm. When the air grew stale, he adjusted again. The work was deliberate and slow, carried out with bare hands numbed by cold and strain. Above ground, snow began to accumulate faster than it could be cleared. Paths between cabins narrowed into shallow trenches. Wind scoured exposed ground down to ice, then filled it again before evening. The foreman remarked that the mountain seemed unsettled, No one argued, but no one altered their plans either, trusting routine over signs. One afternoon, the older resident who had watched Thomas before stopped near the cabin. He observed the sky and said the clouds had not broken like that in many years. Thomas replied only that the vents were nearly finished. The exchange ended without further comment or advice. Night brought deeper cold. Wood cracked sharply in cabin walls as temperatures dropped. Frost formed inside window frames. Thomas spent those hours moving between the stove and the shelter, sealing the final gaps around the floorboards. He brushed snow away from the entrance above and marked its edges so it could be found by touch if buried. By the end of the week, the mountain closed in completely. Peaks vanished, wind held steady for hours at a time, and snowfall no longer paused. The settlement felt smaller, pressed inward by weather that advanced without pause. Thomas finished his adjustments and left the shelter unchanged. From that point, preparation gave way to waiting, as the environment asserted itself and removed any remaining sense of control, narrowing choices with each passing hour and testing resolve before any shelter was truly needed at last. No signal arrived that marked a final moment. Instead, pressure accumulated through ordinary hours, measured in wind, weight, and silence. Each cabin stood as it had before, yet the ground beneath and sky above no longer felt neutral. The mountain asserted presence without sound, setting conditions rather than offering warnings, and leaving every decision already made to face its outcome soon under snow and darkness, with no space remaining for doubt or any delay. Notice the way every detail mattered: stone, soil, and timing. Share this video, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Which survival trick surprised you most? The storm did not announce itself with gradual force. It arrived in a single night, carried on wind that struck the valley without pause. Snow fell so thickly that distance collapsed, turning the space between cabins into a white wall. By morning, familiar paths were gone, filled level with drifting snow that continued to move even after it settled. Roofs bore the first strain. Snow gathered faster than it could slide free, pressing down with steady weight. Beams groaned under loads they had not carried before. Smoke from chimneys failed to rise, pushed flat against the ground and scattered. Doors opened only part way before meeting resistance, and some did not open at all. Movement between cabins became impossible within hours. Men who attempted to cross the clearing turned back after only a few steps, their outlines erased almost immediately. Voices could not be heard beyond arm's length. The wind carried snow into eyes and mouths, cutting breath short and forcing retreat. Thomas Alderidge recognized the change before others reached him. He watched the drift build against his cabin wall and judged the rate of accumulation. When the foreman passed nearby, leaning into the wind, Thomas said only that it was time to go below. The foreman did not argue. He nodded once and moved on toward his own door. The elderly resident arrived first, moving slowly and testing each step. The child followed, wrapped tightly and holding onto the man's coat. Thomas opened the concealed section of floor and guided them down without haste. The entrance closed behind them, sealing out sound and movement in a way that felt immediate. Above ground, the blizzard intensified. Snow forced its way through cracks and froze where it landed. One roof collapsed near the edge of the settlement, the sound lost beneath wind. Another cabin lost its chimney, leaving smoke to spill back inside. Those who remained above ground stayed where they were, conserving heat and waiting for pressure to ease. Below the cabin, the air remained steady. Thomas checked the vents and adjusted them slightly as snow packed over their openings. The elderly man sat against the stone-lined wall, breathing measured and slow. The child asked if others would come. Thomas replied that they would stay where they were. Time became difficult to measure. The storm did not pause, and the darkness below ground made hours blend together. Thomas fed the small stove carefully, limiting fuel and watching the effect on air. When heat rose too quickly, he reduced the draft. When the air thinned, he adjusted again. Above them, the wind continued its work. Snow pressed against cabin walls, burying lower windows entirely. Roofs sagged under weight that did not shift. Livestock shelters collapsed under drifts, and animals that had not been brought inside were lost without sound. At one point, a dull impact shook the cabin. Snow slid from a nearby roof and struck the wall. Dust fell from the ceiling beams, then settled. Thomas listened and waited before making any change. When nothing followed, he returned to his routine. The elderly man spoke once, asking how long the storm might last. Thomas said only that it would pass when it was finished. The answer carried no reassurance and required none. The child leaned against the wall and slept. Hours later, the wind reached a pitch that pressed against the shelter itself, forcing air through every channel. Thomas adjusted the vents again, narrowing one and opening another. His hands shook from cold and effort, but the movement remained precise. The blizzard continued without rhythm or break. Above ground, the settlement was reduced to buried shapes beneath moving snow. Below, the shelter held, not as refuge from danger, but as a place where danger could be endured without exposure. By the time the wind began to shift, no one above ground could have said how long the storm had lasted. The underground shelter had already been tested beyond intention. It remained intact, holding 3 lives while the mountain spent its force overhead, indifferent to structure or habit, reducing the settlement to silence and weight, and leaving survival to whatever space could resist pressure long enough to wait until the storm eased. Below the cabin floor, the shelter settled into a steady stillness that contrasted sharply with the violence above. The walls did not shudder, and the ceiling held its shape. Sound arrived only as a dull pressure, carried through packed soil and timber rather than air. The storm remained present, but distant. Thomas Alderidge maintained a strict routine. He fed the small stove in measured intervals, never allowing the fire to rise quickly. Heat was introduced slowly, held, then reduced. The stone lining absorbed warmth and released it gradually, preventing sharp changes that could weaken structure or air. Each adjustment was deliberate and conservative. The elderly man conserved movement, remaining seated against the wall with a blanket drawn tight. He breathed slowly, counting each rise and fall without speaking. The child slept for long stretches, waking only to drink water or adjust position. No one wasted energy on conversation that did not serve a purpose. Hours passed without visible change. The absence of daylight made time uncertain, but the body registered fatigue in predictable ways. Hunger arrived, then faded. Cold pressed at the edges but did not settle into bone. Thomas measured the air repeatedly, watching the lamp flame and listening for strain in his own breathing. When either shifted, he adjusted the vents by inches, never more. Snow continued to build above them. Its weight pressed downward, but the load was dispersed through the cabin and into the earth around the shelter. Thomas had anticipated this pressure and reinforced the corners accordingly. No cracks formed, no soil fell. The design held without correction. At intervals, Thomas checked the entrance seal, brushing away frost that formed where warm air met cold wood. He reseated the planks and pressed soil into gaps by hand. Each movement cost strength, and he rested after each task rather than pushing through fatigue. Endurance, not effort, guided his pace. The elderly man spoke once, asking whether the air remained good. Thomas nodded and adjusted a vent slightly wider. The exchange ended there. Words did not improve conditions and were not treated as reassurance. Sleep came unevenly. Thomas rested in short periods, waking often to check heat and air. The storm above never fully faded from awareness. Its pressure could be felt through subtle shifts, a tightening or release that traveled through the ground. When that pressure increased, Thomas reduced heat. When it eased, he allowed warmth to return slowly. Water was rationed carefully. Snow melted near the stove in small amounts, never allowed to steam. The child drank first, then the older man, then Thomas. Food was eaten sparingly, enough to maintain strength but not enough to demand more air. The shelter's stability became evident through its lack of incident. No timber creaked, no wall shifted. The air remained clear, cool, and usable. What had been doubted above ground proved adequate below it, not through comfort, but through consistency. Time stretched further. The storm did not pass in hours, but in days measured by exhaustion and routine. Thomas marked intervals by stove feedings and vent checks. The older man adjusted his position when stiffness set in. The child slept again, breathing evenly. Above them, the mountain continued to spend its force, indifferent to the small space resisting it. Below, the shelter did not fight the storm. It endured it by allowing pressure to move around and over it, never meeting force directly. By the time the wind began to shift and snow no longer pressed with the same weight, the shelter had already proven its purpose. Survival had not required strength or speed, only restraint and preparation carried through without interruption. The ground held steady, the air remained usable, and those within waited without urgency for conditions to change. The wind did not stop all at once. It loosened its grip gradually, shifting direction and losing force until snow no longer moved with the same urgency. When silence finally returned to the valley, it felt unfamiliar. Those who had remained above ground waited before emerging, listening for movement that did not come. Cabin doors were opened carefully. Snow stood packed to window height in places, shaped into hard ridges by days of wind. Roof lines sagged where weight had settled unevenly. Several structures had failed outright. One cabin lay crushed inward, its walls pushed flat beneath collapsed beams. Another leaned sharply, its foundation shifted beyond correction. The foreman moved through the settlement slowly, testing footing and clearing paths where possible. He did not speak at first. His attention stayed on damage, on what remained usable and what did not. Others followed at a distance, gathering near those who had suffered loss and offering help without comment. At Thomas Alderidge's cabin, the roof still held its line. Snow had piled against the walls, but the structure stood firm. When the concealed floor section was lifted, the shelter beneath revealed no signs of collapse. The stone lining was intact. The air remained clear. Thomas emerged first, followed by the elderly man and the child, both stiff but unharmed. No one remarked on the shelter immediately. The foreman looked down into the space, then back at the cabin above it. He nodded once, the gesture brief and without expression. There was no praise, and no attempt to revise earlier judgment aloud. What had failed and what had endured required no explanation. Others gathered nearby, some from cabins that had lost roofs or chimneys. They examined the shelter quietly, noting how the ground had carried weight instead of resisting it. One man asked how long they had stayed below. Thomas answered with a measure of days rather than an exact number. Work began at once. Snow was cleared from entrances, and damaged structures were braced where possible. Those whose cabins had failed were taken in by neighbors. Supplies were counted and redistributed. Losses were recorded without dramatics. The elderly man returned to his cabin later that day, moving carefully and stopping often. The child remained close to Thomas for a time, watching as the shelter was sealed again. No one suggested filling it in or altering it. By evening, smoke rose again from most chimneys that still stood. Fires were kept low, conserving fuel until conditions stabilized. The mountain remained quiet, its pressure spent for the moment, leaving the valley reshaped and narrowed by snow. The foreman passed Thomas once more near dusk. He said only that the ground had carried the weight better than expected. Thomas replied that the earth did not move if given room. What remained after the wind passed was not agreement, but evidence. The settlement adjusted its understanding without naming the change. The underground shelter stood as part of that adjustment, accepted as fact by those who had seen what the storm had taken and what it had left behind, and would remember it through later winters. It informed future work, quiet decisions, and preparations made without debate, recorded only in practice, and repeated as conditions demanded thereafter, locally. Years later, when winters returned with their usual certainty, the storm was no longer spoken of in detail. It lived instead in practices that had become ordinary. A single witness, older by then, recalled how preparation changed quietly after that season. He remembered the valley before the storm, when shelters were built upward and outward, trusting walls and roofs alone. Afterward, the ground itself was considered differently. Cellars were deepened. Storage pits were reinforced with stone. Some families cut steps into earth where none had existed, working slowly before the frost set in. The witness had been present when Thomas Alderidge was still a young man. He remembered Thomas not as stubborn or defiant, but as deliberate. The shelter beneath the cabin had not been a challenge to custom. It had been an answer to conditions that were already known, even if rarely acknowledged. In later winters, when snow began to fall early, men measured drifts against markers placed after that storm. Women checked supplies twice before sealing doors. Children were taught where to go if the wind did not stop. These habits were not discussed as lessons. They were repeated because they worked. The witness spoke of one winter, years after Thomas had left the valley, when a lesser storm tested those changes. No lives were lost. Damage was limited. Underground spaces were used without hesitation. No one remarked on their origin. Thomas's name surfaced only when asked directly. The witness said that he had built for silence, not notice. His work remained because it had been placed where weather could not reach it easily. That was all that needed saying. The valley did not change its character. It remained isolated, exposed, and demanding. What changed was the way people met those demands. They did not seek new ideas. They held to what had endured. When the witness finished his account, he did not speak of pride or recognition. He spoke of survival as a process of remembering what failed and keeping what held. The underground shelters were part of that memory, carried forward without ceremony, as tools rather than symbols. In this way, the storm's legacy was not a story told often, but a method practiced repeatedly. The lesson was not framed as wisdom, but as preparation. It stayed with the settlement through later winters, shaped into habit, until it no longer felt like a lesson at all, but simply the way the valley endured its seasons. The witness concluded by noting that memory alone did not keep people alive. Work done ahead of weather mattered more. Earth held warmth, stone resisted wind. Time spent preparing reduced the need for endurance later. These were not theories to him. They were observations made over many winters, confirmed each time the ground froze and the snow returned, steady and indifferent, to the valley. He said that Thomas Alderidge understood this early, and others learned it afterward, not through words, but through continued survival across seasons that offered no forgiveness ever. These lessons from the mountains aren't just history, they're strategies for patience and foresight. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to see more stories of endurance in the wild.